Alrighty, so now that we know what social theory is, now that we know what the parts of social theory are, in this lecture, we're just going to talk about what makes good theory. So what criteria do we use to differentiate between good and not so good explanations of social phenomena that we see out there in the world. So there are three main criteria for evaluating theories. We're going to talk about that now. Then we're going to go through an example to kind of exemplify those different criteria. So the first criteria for evaluating the goodness of a theory or theories is that good theory is internally logical, right? It just makes sense. So if you think about the last two parts of the theory of planned behavior, where if you remember the concept of intention leads into the behavior itself, like whether or not someone's going to engage in that behavior, that makes sense. It's this linear relationship between our intention or to engage in a behavior and then actually engaging in a behavior. If we don't intend to engage in behaviors, it's less likely that we will engage in those behaviors. There's obviously, different exceptions to that. But when we're thinking about overall and the generalizability of something like the theory of planned behavior, which is also a criteria for a good theory, which we'll talk about in a second, generalizability, it's logical that intention leads to behavior. If you intend to recycle, you're more likely to recycle than someone who does not intend to recycle, right? So that makes sense. Parsimony, right? Parsimony is something I struggle with, but it's in a theory, it gets to good theories get to the point as quickly as possible, right? So if you think about the theory of planned behavior, there are just a few different constructs or concepts that led to behavior, right? So I think depending on what form of it you use, there's like 4 or 5 constructs that lead to a particular behavior. So that's parsimonious, right? So it wouldn't be parsimonious if it had like 20 or so different variable or different concepts that lead to a particular behavior. So parsimony is something that we consider to be good when we're thinking and talking about theory. It makes it more simple, it makes it easier to use, while at the same time though, parsimoniousness might shave off some complexity of something like human behavior, and parsimony is one factor that might help explain why theories can't explain everything. But a non-parsimonious theory that explains everything would be way too long to be usable, right? So that's a reason why parsimony is a criteria that we use to say whether or not a theory is good or cruddy. Generalizability. I referred to this earlier when I was talking about the internal logic of good theories, but generalizability just means that good theory is applicable to multiple contexts, right? We don't want to come up with a theory for every single behavior, but we do want to come up with a theory that explains a good number of behaviors, right? And that's what generalizability does in the context of theories that try to explain different kinds of human behavior. So these are the 3 criteria for evaluating theories. This is really important, that they're logical, they're parsimonious, and that they're generalizable. So they make sense, they get to the point as quickly and as concisely as possible, and they're applicable to different contexts. All right, we're going to go through an example from the field of human dimensions of natural resource management, specifically the field of recreation ecology, in which we use social science to try to explain, predict, and influence the behavior of visitors in parks and protected areas. And we're going to talk about perceived crowding in national parks, which is referred to as encounter norms. And so we're going to talk about encounter norms here and theories that surround them. So if you remember, good theories are internally logical, right? So if you think about this framework here, these are the different parts of this theory that's related to encounter norms. So there's a bunch of different parts here, but essentially, people have to be present before you start repeating or before you start reporting other people. So that's the actual density of a place, of a park and protected areas. Reported contacts, seeing others should lead to less satisfaction and greater crowding. So if there's actual people and then there are reported contacts, the actual density, the observable empirical density is going to lead to more reported contacts, and more reported contacts is going to lead to a degradation of an overall satisfaction with the experience at the park or protected area, whatever it is. Also, increased crowding, so perceived crowds should decrease the visitor satisfaction as well. And, actual density, the number of people who are actually there, and reported contacts are going to, increase people's perception of crowding, right? So just to take a step back, actual density is the actual number of people there. Reported contacts are how many people, a visitor is going to see. Perceived crowding is a question, that says, like a question on a survey will ask, how crowded did you feel on a scale of 0 to 7? And then overall satisfaction is just how satisfied are you with the experience, right? So is this logical? I think this makes sense. It seems logical to me. It's logical that the density will lead to more reported contacts, that the density will lead to more perceived crowding, that, reported contacts are going to lead to lesser or like a lower amount of satisfaction, and then perceived crowding is also going to lead to a lower amount of satisfaction. I think that's logical. That makes sense. So I think this theory that touches on encounter norms is internally logical. Good theories are also parsimonious. Again, a parsimonious theory employs just the fewest number of concepts and linkages. These are the different arrows that are necessary to explain an event or phenomena of interest. Overall, if two theories fit the data equally well, so they're the theories themselves help explain what's going on. The one that has more parsimony, the one that's more concise, the one that has a fewer number of concepts and arrows is preferred. Again, this lessens the burden of explanation. And those particular concepts and measurable variables, they are, if something's more parsimonious, that means those individual concepts are more powerful in explaining things. And then as a manager, you can focus on communicating about those concepts in order to change behavior, for instance, at a park. So, is this parsimonious, right? The actual density of a place is going to lead to more or less reported contacts, which is going to lead to more or less perceived crowding, which is going to contribute to one's overall satisfaction with the place. Like, that seems pretty parsimonious to me. We can think of other different variables that might explain overall satisfaction. But this relationship between crowding and satisfaction seems pretty parsimonious to me. Okay, so good theories are generalizable. Remember, they're applicable to all kinds of contexts. This encounter norm theory is going to apply to river rafting. It's going to apply to hot springs. It's going to apply to beaches. It will apply to all different kinds of outdoor recreation contexts. And we'll see in a second that it actually does, that empirical, observable data show that. Again, applicable to other contexts. So one example, which I just referred to, is on perceived crowding. This is from data that's reported in 13 different studies. The studies were conducted across the United States and Canada. There's about 11,000 people who participated, and it had a response rate of almost 90%, which is really good. These data were all collected in person. So response rate is just how many people respond, more or less, the percentage of people who respond. And 90% is super high. For internet surveys, it's something like 1% or less than 1% of people will reply often, unless you go through a service in which you pay people to do surveys. And we'll talk about the benefits and kind of trade-offs of that in this class. But these data are really good. This is what this means. Like, these were good studies, lots of responses across a bunch of different contexts in 2 different countries. Just a couple of examples of how reported encounters, how that's measured, right? So they asked a survey question about how many other visitors did you see while you were on the trail, and they just wrote the number of visitors. or about the number of visitors. About how many other visitors did you see while you were at the summit? And these are different questions about the summit and the trail to get an idea of crowding in these two different places, the summit and the trail of a mountain. This is just an example of one of the studies. Here's another example of how they measured crowding. Did you feel crowded by the number of visitors at each of the following locations? Scale of 1 to 9, from 1 being they didn't feel very crowded at all, to 9 being, yeah, we felt really crowded. Did you feel that at the trailhead, on the trail, and at the summit? Likely just thinking about the way that visitor, like the spatial behavior, the spatial dynamics of crowding. People will probably feel a little bit crowded here, less crowded in the trail, and depending on the place, pretty crowded at the summit, or not so crowded at the summit, again, depending on the place. Encounter norm variable. The encounter norm is basically the acceptable number of visitors that you see in different places. And then the response, or the survey question, is it's okay to see as many as X number of visitors. It doesn't, or just like it doesn't matter to me how many visitors I see, or it matters to me, but I can't articulate a specific number because that's hard to do, right? So these studies aren't perfect. However, despite the lack of perfection in these studies, again, no study is perfect, no theory is perfect, no method in the world out there is perfect to explain everything. This explains, perceptions of crowding pretty well. So across front country, back country, across canoers, across motorboaters, off the coast of Canada, across hikers, bikers, rock climbers, snow coach tourists, wildlife viewers, hunters and anglers, and whether or not people had conflicts on the trail, the lower number of encounters they had, the less crowded they felt, and the more number of encounters they had, the more crowded they felt. This is pretty simple. We'll talk about the value of these studies and this theory in a moment. But there's a really clear, powerful relationship between the number of encounters you have or people have, visitors have, and how crowded they feel in those places. Okay, so the question is, are encounter norms a good predictor for actual tolerances of crowding? This is something that's internally logical, it's parsimonious, it's generalizable, it makes sense. So we think that this is probably a good theory. But is it perfect? No, it's not. It doesn't explain everything that relates to crowding. It doesn't explain soundscapes. It doesn't explain, the impact that the biophysical environment has had because of visitors, which might oddly make people feel more or less tolerant of crowding. They might feel less tolerant of crowding if it's kind of a more perceived as like an untouched, pristine area. Of course, none of these places are pristine or untouched, but people might have that perception. So it's not perfect, right? But is it useful for policy? When we think about policy and we think about something like the Wilderness Act of 1964, which we're going to talk about later on in the semester, the Wilderness Act says that wilderness areas, federally designated wilderness areas that are managed by the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Land Management have to provide, quote, outstanding opportunities for solitude. We don't know what solitude means, really. They didn't articulate that in the Wilderness Act, unfortunately. But we have an idea that it has something to do with perceptions of crowding and how crowded people feel in these areas. So a question is, do people feel really crowded in wilderness areas in which they're legally meant to have opportunities to not feel crowded? Maybe that is useful for policy. You can critique that interpretation of solitude. I certainly do, and I've done research on that. I critique it pretty severely in a lot of ways. But, is it useful for policy? Is it useful for thinking about how many visitors ought to be allowed in particular places, like the Boundary Waters, which is a federally designated wilderness, or the Three Sisters Wilderness out in Oregon, which I used to be a wilderness ranger at, that now has, in certain areas, a limited number of users that are allowed in the wilderness, right? So could it be useful for policy? I think so. Perhaps maybe not the most useful thing in the world, but in terms of how agencies are land management agencies are conceptualizing solitude in the context of wilderness, maybe it is useful. So yeah, I think it probably is based on the way that we understand solitude in these areas. I obviously have some critiques of it, and you can talk to me in class about that if you want. Okay, so in this example, in this theory, I can't speak. I'm going to leave it in. In this lecture, we talked about what makes good theory, right? We talked about the three different components, the three different criteria of what makes theories good or bad. Are they logical? Are they parsimonious? Are they generalizable, right? So do they make sense? Are they concise? With the fewest number of boxes and arrows, if you want to think about it that way, and are they applicable to other contexts? Those are the three kind of components that we should ask ourselves when we're evaluating the goodness of social theory. So I really, really hope that helps us think about what makes theories good or bad. Please let us know if you have any questions. Thank you so much.